Good evening and welcome to our Ken Keltner virtual SABR chapter meeting with Dan Wallach, who's the executive director of the Shoeless Joe Museum and Baseball Library in Greenville, South Carolina. And just before we talk to Dan, Scott Bush from our SABR CEO is on to talk to us a little about our Summer of SABR events that are on the docket. Scott, do you want to kick off?
Yeah, that's great. I appreciate you having me, Dennis. For those of you, hopefully you saw it in this week in SABR, and I think we sent one other announcement out already, and you're certainly going to see future updates as we go through the summer. But our summer virtual programming this year is going to occur one weekend each in June, July, and August. And within that, the July session will be made up entirely of the Jerry Malloy Negro League Conference. It is the only National Negro League symposium in the country. So if you haven't had the chance ever to check that out, that is reason enough to participate. And in June, kicking off, we've got programming focused on the future of baseball. Much of it is coming from from this summer's The National Pastime, which is focused on the next 50 years since SABR has now gone through 50 years of our own. We've also got, of course, the annual business meeting to check our little box with that. But if you're interested in knowing what's been going on organizationally over the last year, the board is giving that update. That's also in June. And then we're also doing a session on international baseball. So one of our really great members, Leonte Landino, who actually works for ESPN producing Sunday Night Baseball, is putting on a series or a session focused on professional baseball in the Caribbean. We'll also do an Olympic preview at that time as well, with the Olympics right around the corner at the end of June. And then when we get to August, we'll do a full 50th anniversary celebration on the date of our founding, which is August 10th. That will include a series of members, including our last remaining original founding member, Tom Hufford. We've got a one-on-one with Howard Bryant. And then later that month, we've got a session on labor relations in baseball as well. So I hope, if you hadn't heard about it before, I hope you'll find out a little bit more on the website. It's $35 to attend all of it. So $35 gets you into every single session for the entire summer. So I hope all of you get a chance to join us for that.
I agree, Scott. I already have it set for the newsletter. I also put the bribe in there that SABR is throwing at us chapter leaders. 2 chapters will have their meetings, have a meeting catered. And it'll be the chapter with the most. We're not the largest chapter, so it's a little tougher for us. And the chapter with the highest percentage will have a meeting catered. And if there's nothing that doesn't help in Wisconsin, free food always works. So I've got the bribe out there also. I haven't added to it that if it looks like we're not winning, that I may buy everyone their first beer. So I haven't thrown that in there yet if I have to. But if I need to add that, I may do that down the road. So
I was going to ask, is beer included? That's huge. So
well, ham's beer, I think Scott still might have a few left.
I might have a few. Stu sent me a care package a few months ago, so I think I was through that pretty quickly. But
well, that's good.
It's hard to source hams in the desert.
You know, I could give up drinking beer if that was what I had to drink.
Very good. Well, I appreciate all of you taking the time to listen, and I hope you'll check that out and see a little bit more about what we've got going on. I think it'll be fun, and I know people are reaching the saturation point with virtual events. So I'm hopeful that we find ways to still bring people together across all of membership, even while you guys start getting together more frequently in person at the local level. So, that we'll see how this one goes this summer, but I'd like to be able to do things like this in the future as we get more in the habit of in-person chapter meetings.
I agree. I think we need to do both because some people can't make it to personal events, and so having an opportunity for both really works well.
That's right.
Yep.
That's right.
Okay.
Thank you, guys. I gotta run tonight. I literally just got back in town from some travel, so I'm getting unburied from work. But thank you all again, Dan. Thanks for joining the group.
Yep. Thanks, Scott. Appreciate the time you can give us. Okay. I'd like to introduce Dan Wallach. I got to know Dan, and for those of you around early enough to hear Perry, from my baseball history podcast. It's one heck of a podcast. So I've had him on my list of people to contact, if for no other reason, just to talk to someone who does a podcast that I enjoy so much. This is kind of a personal meeting for me. So if you guys don't mind coming along, and that's great, I appreciate it. Quick introduction on Dan. As I think I mentioned up front, he's executive director of the Shoeless Joe Museum and Baseball Library in Greenville, South Carolina. The SABR convention in 2010 was in Atlanta, and we went there for a ball game, and we all went into the museum after it had moved the first time, and had a busload of people. We had a great time up there, and the museum was interesting. The ball game was fun. That was one heck of a convention. We had a good time at that one. Dan grew up a White Sox fan after the family moved to Chicago. I don't think any of the Chicago people are on here, so you may be the only White Sox fan on, Dan. He's a Southern Illinois grad. He majored in mass communications and media arts, specializing in sports and news writing for radio and TV. He did radio play-by-play for 6 Saluki Sports. Did I say Salukis right? Okay. Yeah, I lived in Illinois for a while. I thought I learned how to pronounce that. And he hosted and appeared on multiple weekly radio shows. So he's got the background to do these podcasts, and he does them well. After graduation, he worked for a company selling autographed sports memorabilia, and he has a lot of his own collections, including anything Shoeless Joe. So he had a head start on his own. Michael Jordan jerseys and vinyl records. And then, as I mentioned, he hosts the My Baseball History podcast. It's a long form interview format with Dan talking to different people associated with baseball. And he really delves into how do they got started and everything. You learn a lot. And this also allows the Shoeless Joe Museum to have a global audience. I'm sure it probably helps, and it'll help when you guys are reopened. So, Dan, I'd like to give you a Ken Keltner chapter welcome. And if we can, let's talk a little about the museum first. But before we get to that, I have something that we always start our meetings off. Rob Nyer does it for his podcast, so I stole it from there. And that is, what are your earliest baseball memories? I think you're muted. And everybody, if you want to mute, we may not have a problem. There's not a lot, but if you mute, that would help. Go ahead, Dan.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Great. Okay. First of all, thank you for having me. So my dad was born in basically Queens, New York. So the one section of New York that is Mets fans predominantly. And when he was 12 years old, that's when the Miracle Mets overtook the Cubs in 1969 to, eventually win the World Series. So a couple years after that, when his family moved to Chicago, he was like, there's no way I'm rooting for the Cubs. So he became a White Sox fan. So when I was a very little kid, we lived in the Northwest suburbs, and almost all my friends and all of my family besides my immediate family were Cubs fans. So I kind of started watching the Cubs as a very little kid. And I don't know if you have any kids, but if you tell them at 4 years old that they have to move out unless they root for the favorite team, your favorite team, kind of leaves an impression. So I became a White Sox fan. But it was a great time to be a White Sox fan. I was born in 1986, so I grew up in the late 80s, early 90s, and that's when the White Sox were a really fun team. They won the 1993 AL West. They had Frank Thomas and Robin Ventura and all these great players, Blackjack McDowell and Wilson Alvarez and Roberto Hernandez, and even their broadcasting team was incredible. With Hawk Harrelson and Tom Paciorek, it was Hawk and Wimpy, and they had these catchphrases. It was before Hawk Harrelson had overstayed his welcome and became a caricature of himself. But things like, oh, it's a can of corn and a hang woofum, and you can put it on the board. Yes, like he was so much fun to watch every single night, and he was the reason why I wanted to become a broadcaster eventually. Of course I wanted to be a major league player and a professional basketball player too, but I'm 5'7", so that didn't really pan out. But when I realized that the sports career wasn't probably going to happen, I turned to wanting to go into broadcasting. So it was all thanks to Hawk Harrelson and the impact that they had on my childhood. It was definitely, those are my earliest memories, is watching White Sox games as a family and going to games and just having a great time. I mean, there was such a fun young team, and wouldn't trade it for anything.
I can understand, and all those terms for a young person would work. Young people get involved in baseball at a young age. My son hates the Cardinals because 1982 was his first year in baseball. Mm-hmm. So I never thought of threatening like your dad did, although I told my 3 kids that if they got up in the morning, they'd be like the other 3 that they don't know anymore, hinting that I might have killed them if they got up early in the morning. But it didn't work. I've got a series of questions I'll ask. If anybody wants to jump in and ask a question, please feel welcome to do so. So you're talking about your dad gave you this love. Where did your love of baseball history come from? Your dad or somebody else or some other way?
Kind of a mixture of both my parents. My mom is super into all sorts of history, not just baseball history, although she does obviously like baseball history. If you've listened to the podcast, you know that she's on every episode with me at the end. So she definitely is a baseball fan as well. But when we go on family vacations, the very first thing that she would look at is, okay, who was buried here? And she wants to go to the cemetery and check out, like, obviously when we went to Baltimore, the very first thing is, all right, well, we need to go see Edgar Allan Poe. And, when we went to Boston, it was all, where are we going to go to the Revolutionary War sites and things like that. So, when I was, I think 8 or 9 years old, we went on a family trip to Boston and we walked the Freedom Trail. Like that's not really a vacation you take an 8-year-old on, but that's what we did. That's the type of family that we were. So, obviously my dad loved sports and especially baseball. So he would start teaching me about baseball history and, being from Chicago, a big part of the history of baseball in the city is the Black Sox Scandal. That's, how I was originally introduced to Shoeless Joe and that story. Like I said, I was born in 86. So in 1988, the movie 8 Men Out came out. In 89, Field of Dreams came out. So those 2 movies were just constantly on in the background of my childhood. So, I just was always around baseball and baseball history, and it's grown from there. I've collected cards from a very young age and always tried to find the old cards of the old guys. And this was before, the hobby really exploded, and it was an incredibly valuable thing. So it wasn't about trying to collect cards because they were worth something. It was, I wanted to learn the history. I wanted to flip over the back of a 1968 Topps and read Mickey Mantle's stats. I wore number 7 my entire career in any sport that I could because of Mickey. And that's kind of silly when most kids my age didn't have that kind of reverence for sports history, but for some reason I did, and that it just never stopped.
So why this isn't even a question on him. I'm thinking, let's see, a Chicago White Sox fan, your dad was a Mets fan, and you wore number 7 for Mantle. You were, was that where the threat started? That, because
there's no denying Mickey Mantle's greatness. And, I played third base, center field, and pitcher. And so when I was in center field, I just always liked to think that I was like Mickey. I could run down anything. I wasn't a switch hitter, although I tried many times to teach myself how. I just couldn't quite do it. I could bunt really well left-handed, but if that's all you were ever going to do from the left side of the plate, it was pretty, an easy tell if you ever lined up in the left-handed batter's box. So I just stuck with right-handed hitting, but for whatever reason, he was just always somebody I looked up to growing up. And obviously tons more players as well. He wasn't the only guy, but for some reason his story just resonated with me, and I tried to be like him.
Gotcha. So you're living in Chicago, went to school in Southern Illinois. How did you get interested in the Shoeless Joe Museum?
Yeah, so my parents retired in about 2008, 2009, and moved down to Travelers Rest, South Carolina, which is pretty close to Greenville.
Mm-hmm.
And I went to go visit them right after they moved out here. And it was pretty soon after the Shoeless Joe Jackson Museum had opened. So as a baseball history family, as White Sox family, we wanted to go check out the museum. And so we picked out a day where the Greenville Drive were in town. They're the minor league affiliate of the Red Sox. And the museum is located right across the street from Fluor Field, which is where they play. And since they are an affiliate of the Red Sox, they built Fluor Field to look like a mini Fenway Park. So there's, the green monster in left, and they even built seats up on top of it, just like they did in Fenway. So it's a pretty cool stadium. And so we're like, all right, we're going to go see a game. Before the game, we're going to head over to the museum, check that out. And it's going to, that'll be a way to kill a day. So we walk through the museum, and before a curator or a tour guide had a chance to come up and greet us, we just completely immerse ourselves in the museum, and we're pointing out to each other on the walls like, oh, that's what this picture's from, and oh, that's what's happening here. And probably 20 minutes go by, and a tour guide walks up, and they're like, you sound like you know more about this stuff than we do. And we all kind of shook our heads like, yeah, we might. The curator came over, and she was about a 70-year-old woman named Arlene at the time. And she's like, hey, you look like you play baseball. We've got a game going on this Saturday. If you're still going to be in town, you can play in it. And it happened to be the first annual vintage baseball game against the Ty Cobb Museum. So we've played in this game every year. We normally do it in late October, where 1 year we will host the game as the Shoeless Joe Jackson Museum in Greenville, and the Ty Cobb Museum comes up from Royston, Georgia to come play us. The next year they host the game in Royston, and we go down to play them. And like I said, this was the first year that it happened, and I was just in love with the event from day one. The game took place on a Saturday, so the night before we had a practice. The practice was on a field that Joe actually played ball on. It's just that in and of itself made the trip for me, without even playing the actual game, just hanging out at practice with a bunch of these like-minded people who love baseball history. We had descendants from the Jackson family playing that game. Descendants from Ty Cobb were at the game. Historians and experts about both players, and, just vintage baseball in general. So the community of people who played in that game and were at that event made it way better than the game itself. So every year I made it my excuse to come visit my parents. We'd plan that trip around the vintage games. And since it was, associated with the museum, we just started becoming more and more involved with the museum over time. And, whenever I would be in town, we would spend a couple days at the museum and, volunteer as much as we could and donate as much as we could and all that kind of stuff. So over the course of a decade, we got to know each other. And when Arlene stepped down, not too long ago, she's about 80 years old at this time now, and just didn't have the time or the energy to devote to running a museum full time anymore. So she retired, and the board of directors from the museum asked me if I wanted to come take over. And I was like, I live in Chicago. And they're like, yeah, you'd have to fix that. So it was a big decision to make. And it's been a tumultuous year in the life of me, because I moved down here the first week of March 2020, thinking that the museum was going to open, 6 weeks later, and we are still not open. We've had construction delays and coronavirus delays, and all sorts of stuff has gone wrong. So it's been a challenging year. We haven't been open a single day since I came down here to I moved my entire life from Chicago for this job, and haven't really been able to do it the way that I envisioned being able to do it. So that's one of the reasons why we started the podcast. It was just had all this downtime, and I rebuilt our website for the museum. So shoelessjoejackson.org is the website there if you want to check it out, and just did all that kind of stuff because we had nothing else to do. We weren't open, so we've done our best to make things interesting and keep people in the loop as best as we can. And like I said, we're getting ready to open. Hopefully June 15th will actually be the real date this time that will stick.
Now the museum moved a second time, and that's why you've been closed in addition to COVID. Let me see, before I do, there's questions out here.
Sure.
Dixie is saying, thanks for visiting the Freedom Trail. Sorry, Dixie, I haven't been there, so I have to get there, but thank you, Dan.
Yeah.
I was a national park ranger at Bunker Hill Monument in the Charleston Navy Yard from 1997 to 2012. He still does volunteering. I would love to go see that someday. And Mike Ramos, I love the story by Dan. Really interesting backstory. So thank you on those. So, so why did you move the museum a second time?
So originally, the museum, our museum is Joe Jackson's old house. So Joe and Katie lived there from 1941 until 1951 when Joe passed away, and then Katie continued living there until 1959 when she passed away. In 2005, a real estate developer from South Carolina found out that that house was on the market. And he had the foresight to understand that Greenville was eventually going to expand. It was already growing like crazy. And he knew that at some point in the not too distant future, developers were going to come in and buy that property and tear down the house and build a condo complex or an apartment complex or some strip mall. And he's like, we need to save this building because it's history. So he bought the house and approached the city of Greenville and was like, hey, I don't care about the property. I know that the property is going to be something else one day, but we need to save this house. So I will move it anywhere in Greenville as long as you take care of securing the land. I will pay for it to be moved, and I will donate it to the city if you make it a museum. So that's what happened. They moved the house in 2006 from the residential neighborhood that it was in on Wilburn Street here in Greenville, and moved it to the property right across the street from Floor Field on the west end of Greenville. So like I said, at that point, Greenville hadn't quite expanded out that way yet. So the land that they placed us on in 2006 was worth nothing. It was, a triangular shaped piece of property with a railroad track running through it. And cut to, 12 years later, in 2006, they moved the building. We opened in 2008 after about a year and a half of renovations, and operated as a museum for 10 years after that. In late 2018, another development company approached us and said, hey, we want to build a luxury apartment complex on the triangular shaped piece of property that the museum sits on. But since you guys are plopped right in the center of it, the only way that we can fit our building on that property is if you move the building from the center to the corner, so we can, fit the footprint of our building. So we were like, we've already moved this building once. It's not great to move a building. It's certainly not great to move an old building twice. So you really have to sweeten the deal to make this worth our time. What do you got? So they said, okay, well, we'll give you a new roof, a new HVAC system, and we'll build you an addition that's going to essentially double your size. And we're like, okay, when would you like us out? So that, our last day of operation was December 14th, 2019. Again, we thought we were going to be open April 8th, 2020. Things went a little differently with COVID and with construction delays and all sorts of things like that. So this past year hasn't quite played out the way we thought it was going to, but we're really excited with the way that everything has come together. The addition is incredible. It's mainly going to serve as our gift shop, but we are going to have displays in there and exhibits and things like that. Not a lot of people know that Joe was a very successful businessman all throughout life, but especially after his career. During his playing career, he had a cigar store. He had a pool hall in Chicago. He had many different businesses. And then after he retired, or after his career ended, let's say, in Savannah, Georgia, he had a dry cleaning business that was so successful that it had at least 2 locations and at least 20 different employees working for it at its peak. I actually just recently uncovered a newspaper article that mentions a 3rd location, which I have never seen any mention of a 3rd location before. So I'm still trying to do some digging to see if that's verified or not. But we know of 2 locations that existed. And then Joe's mom got sick in 1932 and they moved back up to Greenville to take care of her. And at that point, Joe and Katie opened a barbecue restaurant, and that was successful. But then they decided to put their money into a liquor store. And that liquor store is what made them an incredible amount of money for the rest of their lives. We actually have the original doors to Joe's liquor store in our museum. So we're going to have a new display in the edition that was just built that is completely dedicated to Joe's liquor store. I own an original photo of Joe standing behind the counter at that liquor store with, he's resting his hand on the cash register. I found that exact make and model cash register. So we're going to blow that photo up life size and put it on a wall, and then put a little counter in front with the cash register that I found on top of it, so people can stand behind it and rest their hand and like recreate the photo just like Joe is. So trying to do little things like that, because we don't have any game used things from Joe. We don't have a game worn uniform or a game used bat, even, hats or cleats or anything. It's the stuff that is out there and exists is hundreds of thousands of dollars. Black Betsy, his favorite bat, sold for $600,000 at an auction not too long ago. So, we don't have that kind of money in our budget. So it's hard for us to find actual artifacts. So instead, we've got to kind of get creative in the way that we display things and the way that we make our museum interactive. So we've tried to do that, and we think we've done a pretty good job. And this new edition is going to really help us be able to do that.
I know when we were down there in 2010, all of us SABR people went over to the museum before the ball game, and we had a heck of a time. And so is it a good attraction for people attending the ball game?
Yeah, well, we're trying to make it a better one. One of the reasons why I came down here was because the original hours were every Saturday from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. and that's it. They didn't stay open before games. They didn't stay open after games. They just didn't have the time or energy to dedicate to it, to make this museum what it could be and frankly what it should be. And that's one of the reasons, the main reasons why I'm here is to keep this place open 7 days a week. We're going to be open before and after every single Greenville Drive game, whether it's a night game during the week or a day game on a Sunday. We've gotten calls from the mayor of the city for years saying, please be open, like just open more. They say at the county municipality buildings that they receive more calls about our museum from out-of-towners who are looking to visit Greenville than any other location in Greenville. Like, people want to come check out Joe's house, and he's buried here in Greenville, so people ask questions about where he's buried, and there's a statue of him. So people ask, but all of these questions are coming in day after day after day, trying to visit these Shoeless Joe Jackson sites in Greenville. And the fact that we've never really given people a proper chance to visit our museum is it's killed us, and that's something I'm going to change. So we're excited to stay open as often as possible, and think it's going to give people an opportunity to learn the true story about Shoeless Joe and why he's somebody that we are still talking about over 100 years later.
It is amazing. One of the questions that was out there is, how are you guys surviving over, the question from Dixie was, not trying to pry, but how are you guys basically paying for everything if you have not been open? So are you becoming successful at fundraising, or boy, that's tough to do for a nonprofit?
Yeah, we're trying to become successful at fundraising. This past year, I started a membership program for our museum for the first time ever. So if you go to our website, shoelessjoejackson.org, one of the tabs at the top is join. So you can become a personal member, or if your company wants to become a corporate sponsor, we offer both of those options. There are lots of different tiers within the personal membership option of, do you want just the pin? Do you want a pin and a t-shirt? Do you want a pin and a t-shirt and a hat? All these different levels, all the way up to a personal guided tour around Greenville with me, where I take you to all these sites that are Joe Jackson related. So I'll take you to the old ball fields that he played on, and take you to his cemetery, and all these different places. So tons of different options if you want to support us. Obviously donations are a big help too, but I also have been taking a fraction of my salary. So there's, that's one way that we've kept the museum afloat is I've made it happen that way. So obviously it can't continue that way forever. And hopefully with us reopening and the public being able to come visit us, that will change. But it's been a rough year. So all the help that we can get has been appreciated, and all the help we can get moving forward to start us off on the right foot again would be huge for us.
I think some of us should go out and take a look at some of that membership where we can help. So I agree with you 100%. Now the museum hasn't been open and you haven't been there a long time, but what are you most proud of your museum at this time? Oh, that's very nice, Perry.
Well,
you remember?
Yeah.
Show it off. You're a member already. We're not. Yeah.
Yeah. Perry was one of our early members, so very appreciative of her. And for those of you who weren't around for the first few minutes of the meeting, we've also had Perry on the podcast, so check that out too. She's been great for us.
In the newsletter where we introduced your coming on, I listed 3 recents: Perry's, Richardson, and who's the guy? Your second one, which was the first episode that wasn't the intro.
Mike Miller.
Yeah, Mike Miller. I knew his last name was Miller, who was the who was kind of the expert down there on Shoeless Joe. And that was a very interesting one, because those of us who've done research, listening to him trying to do his digging through research and what he's done, and then you were making comments what you've done, it just reminded us how tough research can be sometimes. So it was very good.
And one of the things that I've run into is, and I'm sure anybody who is in this room right now who has tried to do digging into old newspaper articles, there are so many things that were said and printed that are just flat out false. Like the vetting process was so different than it is today. And not that everything that gets printed today is fact either. Obviously it's not. But I've read so many different interviews, let me put that in air quotes, interviews with Joe Jackson, that the writer claims that Joe said something that I know for certain Joe would have never said. So a lot of interviews in the early 1910s and 1920s were very up for interpretation. And even the spelling of words, the street that the Jacksons lived on, depending on who was writing the article, it was Wellborn Street or Wilburn Street or Wellborn with an E at the end. So it's really hard to find accurate information, and you kind of have to do a ton of research and then make your best guess as to what is the most likely version of the story, as opposed to taking the very first thing you read as gospel and then re-spouting that out to everybody. And that's been a big challenge for our museum. And to get back to your question, what am I most proud of? We are, for the first time, really going to consider ourselves the arbiters of truth, and make sure that only verifiable statistics and verifiable truths and records get represented at our museum. Because I've heard stories from people who have taken tours in the past that there'd be a picture on the wall that we'd claim Joe Jackson's in this picture, and he's not. It's whether it's supposedly him as a child in the mills in the early 1900s in Greenville, and there'd be a red dot over a child in the picture, and they would say, oh, this was Joe Jackson. It's like, but it's not. And now if somebody knows that photo exists and knows that Joe isn't in it, everything you say for the rest of your tour comes into question. If one thing is wrong, then how can I believe you about anything else? So that's something that I'm taking very seriously, as to try and make this as accurate as possible, and just historically correct. That's very important to me as a historian.
And I understand, as SABR and all the publications and things that we're involved in, I think the things we say, but we're SABR. And so we have to be right. And it's kind of just understood, we're SABR. It's got to be right. So yeah, you're right. If you have a mistake, they're going to say everything's wrong. So I appreciate that.
And I'm not sure, do you guys know about man cave pictures or man cave photos? they're a team of brothers. One is located in Virginia, one is in Thailand, and they digitally restore and colorize old photos. I've been working with them for months now, and they're going to help us with almost every single image that appears in our museum. We've gone through our archives, mostly my personal archives of things that I've found of Joe over the years, and restored them. And so, like I said, almost all of the images that are going to appear in our museum once we reopen have been retouched in some way by Man Cave. We've gotten in kind of, I wouldn't say arguments, because we're all on the same page at the end of the day, but they love to colorize photos. And some of the old photos of Joe, especially the ones of him in the textile leagues or, the barnstorming days, where we don't know exactly what color the uniform is. So they'll want to take a guess. And it's like, I can't put that photo on the wall unless I'm 100% certain, because I am the museum, I am the source. I have to be the person who is the be all end all. So if I put a picture on the museum's wall that says this uniform was green, and somebody comes in and says, no, that uniform was red. Yeah. Again, it just calls into question every single thing that I say and do. So I'm always of the mindset of, let's keep it black and white. Nobody needs to see it in color. They've never seen it in color before. So of course we want it to be in color. And if we find out what the true color was, of course we're going to colorize it and put it up and make it accurate so people can see it in a way that they've never seen it before. We're going to have some really incredible displays in our museum. And when you see these photos blown up, some of them are going to be life size or even bigger than life size. It's really going to blow you away. But I'm being very cognizant of the fact that I'm not putting anything up on those walls unless I know for certain this is the way it really looked.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I like that. Dixie's got another question. How far away from the original location is the house now? And did the construction company put a plaque up indicating the original house location for the touring public?
Yeah, good question. The original location is about, they cut the house in half so it could fit on 2 flatbed trucks because they literally needed to drive it down the street. So taking the roads, it was about 3.1 miles. If you flew as the crow would fly, it's a little over 2.5. They did not put a plaque on the original site because it's still in a residential neighborhood. So they didn't want to draw attention and bring a bunch of crowds into the neighborhood and disturb the peace of the neighbors who still live there. We're trying to figure out a way to tactfully do that. But again, that property is, it belongs to somebody now. So we're in the talks of trying to figure out what's a tasteful way to put up a plaque or at least recognize that this was the original site. We also, one of my goals is to renovate some of these old ball fields that are in Greenville. So Joe started playing baseball in what was known as the Textile League. There were 18 different cotton mills and textile mills within a 3-mile radius in Greenville at its peak. And each mill would have its own baseball team because mill work was dirty and dangerous and didn't pay well. So if a mill that was, a half mile down the road was offering 5 cents more a week, employees would go work there because it was 5 cents more a week. So to combat that, the mill owners started these baseball teams as a way to improve morale and create this sense of pride in your mill. So even if somebody was offering 5 cents more, you wanted to stay here because, well, you were proud of this team, you were proud of these players. So that's how Joe got to start playing baseball. Some of those fields still exist. Some of them are not quite baseball fields anymore, but just plots of land. Some of them have been repurposed or have had buildings built on top of them. So obviously we can't do that. But one of my pet projects that I want to, pursue over these next few years as we get better funding and a little bit more pull in the city is to renovate those old ball fields and get them in playing condition again for the communities that live around them. So on those fields, when they happen, we will certainly be putting up plaques to commemorate this is the history that happened here, not just Shoeless Joe, but all the people who played there, men and women. We're going to have a list in the museum of people who played in the Textile League that also played Major League Baseball. We have nearly 100 names on that list. It wasn't just one lucky kid who made it out. It was an extremely talented league. And, for a while, Greenville was known as the hitting capital of America. So some great hitters and great baseball players came out of this town. And it's actually funny, Joe was discovered by a scout for Connie Mack from the Philadelphia Athletics, who was not coming to scout Joe Jackson. Connie Mack was famous for liking college-educated players on his team. And there was a player on Joe's team in the 1908 Greenville Spinners named Hyder Barr, who was a graduate of Davidson College. And so Connie Mack knew that this guy, Hyder Barr, was a good player. And since he was college educated, he sent a scout to go check out Hyder Barr. When the scout got to Greenville and saw how great Joe Jackson was, he sent a telegram back to Connie Mack and said, hey, we got to sign both these guys. And Connie Mack said, okay, bring them back. And so that's what happened. So again, it was not just a 1 in a million shot that Joe Jackson made it out of Greenville. It was a lot of guys from this area were great baseball players and have gone on to play in the major leagues.
The podcast with Mike Miller covered some of that too very well.
Yeah.
So I agree. Before we move on to the podcast, anybody have questions about the museum or anything else they'd like to ask Dan? Thank you, Dixie, for your questions, by the way.
Yeah, thank you.
Takes the pressure off of me. So, yeah. Okay, let's talk about the podcast.
Sure.
My first question, I think you might have answered my first question. What was the motivation and thought behind the podcast? And it looks like something to get the word out on the museum was part of it.
Yeah, definitely. I've had all this experience with, radio broadcasting and just my love of sports and history. And I'm not a huge podcast listener. I've tried to listen to a handful in the past. The ones that I really like, and I try to listen to every episode, but I'm very finicky and particular about what I like to listen to. And the production quality turns me off of a lot of podcasts. And, if some people play music in the background and the music is so loud that you can't really hear what the person is saying, like that type of stuff is so frustrating to me. Or if the interviews are done over the phone and the quality of the audio is bad, like I'm a huge Michael Jordan fan. I have over 100 jerseys hanging in a room. I literally, when I was searching for houses in South Carolina when I was going to move here, one of the qualifications for a house that I needed on my must-have list was a room that was big enough to properly display my Michael Jordan jersey collection. Like that's how much I love Michael Jordan. If Michael Jordan was on a podcast, on a phone interview, and the audio quality wasn't good, I would not listen to the podcast. Like that's how finicky I am, because it's just, for me, I don't know why, but it's just frustrating for me to listen to it that way. So I knew from day one, all right, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to get pro gear. I'm going to ensure that all of my interviews take place in person, so I have the best possible sound quality. And I just think that the quality of the conversation is better in person. You can read the body language. You can read the social cues of, when somebody's done speaking. That doesn't always happen over the phone. You have people talking over each other. You've got the sound delays from the technology. When you do a Skype interview, there's always the, a 2-second delay. And then one person thinks they're done talking, so the other one starts talking, and then the other one wasn't quite done, so they're talking over each other. Like, I hate that stuff. So when I decided I was going to do my podcast, I was like, I'm going to do it well. I'm going to have it sound great. And I know the type of research and the level of, detail that I like to go into. So I know it's not for everybody. Some of these episodes are more than 3 hours long. I know that is a ridiculous amount of time for some people, but for the people who are, invested and into that kind of thing, I've gotten really, really good feedback, and people seem to love it. So pretty excited. And like you mentioned earlier, it has been a way for us to have a global audience. I just looked at my stats the other day. We've been listened to in over 35 different countries. That's crazy. I would have never thought, I started a Twitter account for the museum in August of 2019. We're closing in on 5,000 followers already in not quite a year and a half. those numbers are insane to me, that just through the sheer power of social media, we have this many people interested and invested and, knowledgeable about what we're doing here at the museum. It's really powerful. And that, it's a lot of work to put the podcast together, but when you see the results, it makes it all worth it. It's fun to watch everything grow.
You do violate, some people say anytime a podcast goes past 35 minutes, 40 minutes, it's too long. And there are some podcasts, if they get long, I don't want to listen to. Yours, they're long and I know they're long, and I time my listening so that I have the time dedicated to it because I don't want to miss it. And,
Thank you.
and like I said, I for those who were on earlier, I try to get at least 5 miles in. I usually walk at night. So I get somewhere between 5 and 6 miles walking at night, and I listen to podcasts. And I'm not sure I'd walk. I think podcasts are one of the reasons I go out and walk. If I don't walk, I don't listen to podcasts. So I'm always feeling more guilty that I'm missing a podcast than I'm missing the steps. So I agree with that. One of the things that you introduced, and you say this each year, is that the podcast is not dedicated to Joe Jackson, but the first one every year will be about Joe. But you reserve the right to talk about Joe during different podcasts, but you really want to talk about baseball history and talk to a lot of different people in different fields in baseball, like you had Perry on talking about umpiring, so what's behind that decision to do that?
Well, when I first kind of conceived of this idea for the podcast, I was originally, thinking, would it make sense to do something that's just Joe Jackson related? And so I'm trying to, plot together, okay, what would a season look like, a podcast season? And, Joe hasn't played in over 100 years. So it's not like there's new information or new statistics or anything like that coming out on a regular basis. There are new finds every few months, or some new artifact is uncovered, or some new photo gets released, or, something like that. So there is, ongoing research happening and things that we've never seen or heard before. But is that enough to, drive a podcast that is, dedicated every episode to Joe? I just knew that eventually there would come a day where there isn't anything more we could talk about. Especially since most of the people who knew Joe are either gone already or are on, the last few years of their life. So if it could have been an instance where all of his family members were still alive, and, a new episode could have, maybe a 20-minute segment with an interview with them talking about their memories or things like that, then I could have seen it maybe being more Joe centric. But I just knew that wasn't a long-term sustainable model. So I was like, all right, well, what is? And I knew that if I could, I enjoy performing interviews. I think I am pretty good at doing the research and writing good, relevant questions. Another thing that bothers me about listening to other interviews, not necessarily podcasts, but just like when people are on talk shows, or when SportsCenter has a 5-minute segment of an interview with somebody, and they're all just fluff, garbage questions. Like, you're talking to Hank Aaron and you're asking him questions that, like, it doesn't matter who you're talking. You could ask this question to anybody. Like, no, it's Henry Aaron. Like, ask him about what he went through. Ask him about his career. Ask him about specific at-bats, because he remembers that on a 3-1 count in 1971, he got a curveball when he was looking fastball and he still hit it out. Like, guys remember those details. And that's the type of stuff that I want to talk about. And I knew that if I, set my goal of talking to former players or current players, managers, guys like that, I will never run out of people to talk to that have an association to the game of baseball. One of my goals, being so close to the Greenville Drive, every year I want to talk to the GM and ask him, all right, who are the 3 guys on the team this year who are going to make it one day? Because the Greenville Drive in the past decade have had Xander Bogaerts, Yohan Moncada, Clay Buchholz, previously Anthony Rizzo, Mookie Betts, like all these guys have come through and played for the Greenville Drive. So I'm not expecting the best player in baseball in the next 10 years to be on the Drive, but they're going to have some major leaguers. So one of my ideas is to talk to 3 guys every year and ask them, the same set of questions, and have just a short little interview with each of them, maybe 20 or 30 minutes tops, and ask put all 3 of those interviews together in one episode, and then follow up 1 year later and ask those same 3 guys the same exact set of questions to see how their perspective has changed, how their lives have changed, how their careers have progressed, and then hope that in 5 years or 3 years or 10 years or whatever, somebody turns into a real superstar, and we've got this now decade-long relationship where we've been talking to each other for 10 years. And that's the kind of long-term goal that I have with the podcast, that if it were just about Joe Jackson, you'd never have something like that. It's not possible to have an ongoing series like that. So that, again, that was just one of the reasons why I wanted to make it about baseball history and baseball in general, as opposed to just about Joe Jackson.
And you do a very good job of that, because you don't ask the fluff questions, and you dig down, and as a listener, I know, okay, you did your research on this question. I'm curious to see what the answer is going to be, because you dig in, and you do a very good job of getting people to open up and talk to you. They're very not afraid to give opinions. Perry, I loved when you were on. You had, you didn't hold back. You let everybody know exactly how you felt, and that just helped a whole lot understanding what you're talking about. And Dan does a very good job of getting that and his follow-up question. So, that's why I had this interest to introduce him to other people, because of the quality of those podcasts. So I agree.
Thank you.
Perry out here has on here, the linear notes are spectacular for every episode. She's saying you should add 1 umpire per season to those 3 players. That's interesting.
The liner notes is what I was commenting on. The liner notes that he does for the podcast. Yeah. That you are so meticulous and conscientious about everything you do, Dan, and I really appreciate that, because I absolutely agree. I mean, I'm not even famous, but I have had a lot of articles written about me during my 40 years of umpiring, and inevitably in every single one, at least 2 or 3 facts are completely wrong, no matter how many times I repeated it.
Right.
It's funny. And you're so right, especially coverage of women ball players back in the late 1800s, before the All-American girls. The coverage was just ridiculously sexist and demeaning, and often had nothing to do with the reality of the talent that the women actually had on the field. So thank you for pointing that out. Yeah. Figuring out the truth is not an easy task for us human beings. It really is, it's a skill, and it takes a lot of critical reasoning skills to be able to figure that stuff out. So I really appreciate your applying that philosophy to what you're doing with the museum.
Thank you.
And I'm sure that Jacob Pomrenke does too, because he's the other authority on.
He's been a great help with a bunch of different stuff, and we're going to have one room in our museum. And you asked earlier, Dennis, about what I'm most proud of at the museum. Mm-hmm. The layout that we're going to be, showing everybody is going to be so meticulously thought out. Before, there was really no rhyme or reason to what rooms had what photos in them. There was no chronological order or anything like that. And that's something that I have been just adamant about, that the tour is going to go in a chronological order so people can watch the progress of Joe's life and career. And so one room is going to be dedicated to just his White Sox career. And of course, it's going to talk about some of the Black Sox scandal, but he played for, from 1915 to 1920 with the White Sox, and won a World Series in 1917 with the team. Not a lot of people know that or remember it. So we are going to cover that. But as part of the Black Sox coverage, Perry, you mentioned Jacob, we are going to have a huge display, floor to ceiling, about the 8 Myths Out project that SABR did in 2019. for the 100th anniversary of the Black Sox Scandal. And Jacob and his team, the Black Sox Scandal Research Committee, did an incredible job at researching for years, trying to debunk some of these myths that are ingrained in people's brains. Elliot Asanoff wrote 8 Men Out in 1963 and did the best job that he could, but that was almost 60 years ago now, and we just didn't have access to all of the documents and all of the court transcripts and the player contract cards that we now have access to. So when he wrote the book in 1963 and then it was turned into a movie in 1988, they weren't working with the same set of facts that we have today. So that got put out into the public, and that became the story that people took as the gospel truth. And one of our jobs as the museum is, we're grateful that those movies exist, 8 Men Out and Field of Dreams, because it gets people familiar with the story of Joe Jackson and familiar with the Black Sox Scandal. But our job is to get those people through the door and then reprogram them to say, like, hey, we know this is what you think, and we know this is what you've been taught, but not all of it is true. And here's the proof. So we couldn't thank Jacob and the Black Sox Scandal Research Committee enough for all the hard work that they've done, because it's a tough job trying to get the truth out there. And Jacob and I actually had an exchange on Twitter not too long ago with somebody who was saying, oh, I'd be curious to know what the truth is about this one particular thing. And so we're like, all right, here's the link to the 8 Myths Out project. And the guy was like, oh, well, where did that research come from? And it's like, click the link. It's all there. Like it says clear as day where the research came from. And he's like, oh, well, I'd just be curious to see where it all. It's like, guy, if you want the answer, we're giving it to you. We're trying to tell you what you're, supposedly so skeptical about. So that's going to be a struggle, and we know that some people don't want to be convinced what the truth is. So you kind of just have to grin and bear it with those type of people. But for everybody else, it's our job to be the arbiters of truth and teach people what the real story is and back it up with evidence, and not just what we want the truth to be. And that's going to be hard for a lot of people to hear, but that's our job as a museum, is to tell people what really is happening.
And
Right.
this is Stu in Minnesota, and just kind of on that note too, certainly the hard facts, and that Comiskey wasn't the miser and all of that, which is, with so many myths, almost impossible to stop, but good for doing what you're doing. But how about just the portrayal of Jackson? Because that becomes, a little fuzzier thing. Field of Dreams, of course, brought up, or everybody brings up, that he had 357, and so he couldn't have been tossed in the series. You've got a museum to celebrate a person's life, but getting into the hard truths of Jackson personally and what his role is in the World Series, what are the challenges, and how do you deal with that?
Well, I think my approach is really to make it obvious that I'm not trying to sugarcoat anything. When people come back and try and challenge on certain things, there are different ways to approach it and to couch your answers and things like that. People can see right through that. So if you're not honest and you skirt questions, or try and be like a politician, where you're asked a yes or no question and you say, well, that's a great question, and here people are going to see right through that. So if we tell stories like in between the 1914 and 1915 season, Joe wanted to go on a vaudeville trip, and he went basically all around the southeast, going on these vaudeville shows, and took out basically ladies of the night with him on stage. It was called Joe Jackson and His Baseball Girls, and would give him hitting demonstrations on stage, and was making so much money that he didn't want to report to spring training in 1915, because he was making more money doing his vaudeville show than he would have as a baseball player. And it wasn't until Katie, his wife, sent a police officer with divorce papers that Joe kind of got his attention back and reported to spring training. So obviously Joe and Katie didn't get divorced. It was just a scare tactic that worked. But that was the start of a kind of a tumultuous 1915 season. Later in 1915, Joe got into a car accident. In July, the Cleveland Indians at that point, they had just been renamed the Indians from the Naps, had an off day. So Joe and Katie were driving around Cleveland, and Joe heard a noise coming from his engine. And instead of stopping the car and pulling over, he just had Katie slide over and get behind the wheel. And he walked out on the running board of the car while it was still moving. And they got sideswiped by a wagon, and Joe got dragged 75 feet and thought his career was over. He said he could see his elbow through, like popping out of his skin. Was badly injured and was out for 3 weeks. And when he came back, it was not a month later that he was traded to the White Sox. So, there was kind of this tumultuous offseason and start to the 1915 season. And then he gets in this car accident where he's clearly just, being reckless. And the Cleveland franchise was just like, hey, we can't build our team around you if this is how you're going to act. So you got to get out of here. And so, when we tell stories like that and make it clear that we're not trying to paint Joe as this saint, we know that he knew what was going on in the 1919 World Series. Do we think he participated? No, I do think that he tried his best to win those games, and we're going to have a display in the museum that shows his statistics from the 1917 World Series, where he batted just over 300 and didn't have as many RBIs and didn't have as many runs, and the team won. So if that was what he did in a series when his team was supposedly trying and they won the World Series, then how can his statistics be better in a series where he was trying to lose? That's,
I hate to say, but you're right there on the series. To me, you sound like you're sugarcoating it, because I don't even know that just a comparison of 17 to 19 tells you a hell of a lot. And I haven't gotten into it nearly as much as you have, or the people on Jacob's committee. When did the hits come, things like that. But he did take money, didn't he? And if he took money and then didn't try to lose, isn't that kind of unethical with the gamblers? Or you've like you say, when you did that in 15, what went on, he showed he wasn't a saint. But is there a real strong basis for being able to say that he's more like Buck Weaver than Chick Gandil?
Well, definitely an interesting point. We're not exactly sure when Joe received the money. If it was after game 4 and then he still played more games after that, yes, it does look a little worse than if he got the money at the end of the series. We believe that he tried to give that money back. We believe that before the series started, he tried to go to the owner of the team and the manager of the team and say, I don't want to be a part of this. Please sit me out. If you have to tell the press that I was drunk and you suspended me, so be it. Do what you need to do. I don't want to be a part of this. And they said, Joe, you have to play. We can't sit you in the World Series. So, was he aware that something was going on? Absolutely. But when you look at his statistics, even if he got the money after game 4, which he wasn't handed directly from the gamblers, he was given that money from Lefty Williams, his close personal friend on the team, his roommate, one of the pitchers on the Black Sox, as it were. Lefty was given $10,000 from the gamblers and told to give 5 of it to Joe. So Joe got that money from Lefty, not directly from a gambler. So we don't believe that Joe ever had any direct contact with the gamblers. He wasn't at any of the meetings or anything like that, which his teammates all agreed to and said under oath. So it is a tricky situation. My contention has always been, let's concede the fact that he did throw the World Series. His banishment was a lifetime banishment, not a permanent banishment. So when he passed away in December of 1951, that should have made him eligible again for the Hall of Fame. And like I said, I don't think that he tried to throw the series. He hit the series only home run in game 8. It's after he would have allegedly taken the money or received the money if it happened after game 4. That timeline is a little messy, so we're not exactly sure, and probably never will be exactly when those things took place. But his statistics were still good late in the series after everybody alleged that it had been thrown. So,
Dan, excuse me, this is Bob Beege from Milwaukee.
Hey, Bob.
I'm wondering if the museum is going to cover the relationship between Joe and Ray Cannon. I think there's a lot of stuff there, and a lot of it is not clear. I'm just wondering if that's one of the subjects that'll be included.
We're not going to have a permanent exhibit dedicated to that, but we would like to have maybe a rotating exhibit at some point. We do have some of the papers from the Canon files. We still have to look into exactly what legally we're allowed to display publicly, because I think some of those documents are still technically private. So that is something that we're going to have to look into in the future and figure out. But yeah, we are definitely aware of Ray Cannon and his relationship with Joe, and that is something we'd like to explore in the future, but don't have any concrete plans for that as of yet.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Dan, we're past the hour mark. Are you good with some more questions? Or...
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm ready to go.
Okay. I'd like to ask at least one more on the podcast. And this is the question that it's probably the most unusual segment in your podcast. You talk to your mom.
Yeah.
Now, when I first saw that, I thought, why is this guy bringing his mom on? Well, as you heard earlier, she's a historian. She's a collector herself. And as a person who walks and listening to these, questions come up in my mind. First off, Linda doesn't care about this stuff, so I can't go and say, hey, and she's gonna be to look like, okay. And so there's no one to discuss it with. And you and your mom kind of discuss those points. So, and she says, well, he said this or she said, and it makes a very interesting review of what you just heard. What was the idea behind bringing Lori on?
That was exactly the idea. When I do listen to podcasts that I like, I'm always listening to them alone. I never listen to a podcast with somebody else. Yeah. So I always want to talk about what I just listened to with somebody and never have that opportunity. So even I have friends who listen to the same podcast that I listen to, but if I listen on Tuesday and they don't listen till Friday and I'm busy on Saturday, just because we listen to the same podcast doesn't even mean that we have a chance to really discuss it the way that I would like to. So I figured that would be a fun thing to do. I also, had been living in Chicago my whole life, and my mom moved down to South Carolina 12 years ago. So I thought this would be a great time for us to spend time together and, talk about what I've got going on with the podcast and the museum. So I just figured, hey, it'd be fun to sit down and listen to these episodes with her. And I knew that she had a unique perspective on things, and the generation gap. Yes, she is my mom, so we've got a good, rapport and chemistry, but I thought it would be interesting to talk with somebody who's a little older than I am to get kind of a unique perspective that I couldn't possibly have because I didn't live through those times. Or, if I talk to a guy like Bobby Richardson, I can read as many books as I want about Bobby Richardson, and I can, do as much research as possible, but nothing I can do or read or experience will ever put me in her place, where like she lived through those years, and she knew what it was like to watch the game of the week and watch him play in the World Series and things like that. So that type of relationship and experience that she brings is invaluable to me. I mean, I think it adds something really interesting. And I was kind of skeptical at first, and I know that everybody has the same story when they listen to their first episode of my podcast. They're always like, he's got a segment with his mom, and then it turns out that normally happens to be their favorite segment of the podcast. So I also know that with the long form, it kind of breaks it up into different parts. I've got the intro is probably normally about 10 minutes. Then the interview, depending on the subject, is anywhere from like 45 minutes to, it could be 2 hours. And then the segment with my mom is another normally half hour to 45 minutes. And then I've got the outro where I kind of do some sort of baseball history research and try to have it tie back into something that was talked about in the podcast episode. So those those different segments kind of are 4 different podcasts, the way I look at it. Obviously I tie it all together and make it one long thing, but if you want to just listen to one segment at a time and break it up over a few days, it's easy to do that. So I just thought it would be a fun idea and a good, cool way to spend time with my mom. And I knew that she was going to be great because she's well-spoken and well-researched and interesting to talk to. So yeah,
Well, she is. I was looking forward to meeting you, and I was hoping she'd be on the podcast. I kind of wanted to meet the other star of the podcast. So
yeah.
so let her know that, if you
I
would.
will. Thank you.
What are you most proud about your podcast, or are there any stories that is there any 1 or 2 stories that were told to you that just jumped out as these were really fun or interesting?
Man, I think there's been something interesting in every episode. From the very first episode, talking with Mike Miller, the Shoeless Joe Jackson historian, even to Greg Kreinler, the artist. I've spoken with a lot of artists so far, and I know that that's kind of hard in a podcast format, which is one of the reasons really that I did the liner notes, was because I knew some of my first interviews were with visual artists. So no matter how well we describe an image that they're painting or photographing or anything like that, there was no possible way that we could get that across just in audio. So I knew, all right, if I have these liner notes, people can go check it out and see, all right, this is the painting we're talking about. And if we're talking about a specific detail on it, like, you can blow it up and you can see this is exactly what we're talking about. So I started a website. It's shoelesspodcast.com. You can check out all the liner notes from every episode. Those are a ton of work to put together, but man, I'm so proud of those. I know that the people who do take advantage of them really genuinely appreciate them and love them. What I try and do is go in chronological order of the way our conversation flows. And if whoever I'm talking to brings up a person or an event or an image or something like that, I will throw up a picture with a couple links that if people want to do some more research, they can click those links and check it out. So when I had Phil Dixon, he's the Negro League's author and historian, I had him on, and he was just rolling with all these names of former Negro League players. And of course, some of them were names that we knew, like Cool Papa Bell and Satchel Paige and Josh Gibson and Buck O'Neill and all these guys. But there were so many names that most people have never heard of. And so I thought that those liner notes were particularly important, because it was a chance for people to really dig deep and see. Obviously you can't have the career statistics of a player whose career statistics were never fully properly kept. But if you can kind of get a snapshot of what type of player this guy was, or see him in a photograph, it turns them into a real person instead of just a name that you hear or a line in a history book. It makes them a presence, and I think that's important. That when I'm listening to podcasts like this, that's something that I wish they did sometimes. So I knew that it was going to be another good bit of work to do that for every episode, but in the long term, I think it is well worth it.
Yeah, I agree. I want you to know that I'm not a Yankee fan. I think because the 58 Braves lost to the Yankees, and like my son at the Cardinals, I'm just not a Yankees fan. So when you tried me, when you put the Bobby Richardson on there, oh, it's a damn Yankee. His stuff is so good, but it's a Yankee. I enjoyed that one. I thought, okay, maybe the Yankees aren't all evil, but it's so because you dig in and talk to them, and you bring out the person in a lot of these ball players that I enjoy so much. So thank you very much for that.
Yeah, I think the long form allows that to happen. When you just have 20 minutes with somebody, you don't have the time to get the emotional response, because you can't build up that trust. And if you notice, I try and form my interviews in chronological order also, and that's not just a tactic to make it easier to follow along, or because I'm doing research and reading their Wikipedia page and like, all right, well, things are listed in this order, so I'm going to read it in that order. That is an interview tactic tactic to get people to open up to you. And so if you start with their childhood and get them vulnerable and thinking and put them back in a place mentally where they're trying to remember how they felt as an 8-year-old going to their first baseball game, from minute 1, you've got them. And then when minute 55 comes around and you ask them a really hard-hitting question, they're open to it. And they're willing to give you an answer that they wouldn't have given you. If you ask that same exact question first, you wouldn't get the same answer. So you've got to meander your way to, through a lot of things that you might not necessarily care about the answer. They're interesting, but you're not really there for that. You're there for this one that's coming later, and you've got to build up to it. So I think that's what the long form allows me to do. And what I try to do, obviously, if you've listened to an episode, you know how much research I've done for each individual person. But, I try and listen to as many interviews that they've given or read as many interviews that they've given as I possibly can. So I'm aware of specific questions that they've been asked time after time after time. Like, if you know that Bobby Richardson was the 1960 World Series MVP and he's the only World Series MVP of a losing team, how many times in the past 60 years do you think he's been asked the question, would you have traded that World Series MVP to have won the World Series? Like, of course. So am I going to waste my time asking him that question when he's been asked it a million times and people can find it a million times? No, I want to ask questions that they've never been asked before, or find a way to ask a question they've been asked a million times before, but in a new way that they approach it from a different angle and answer it in a way that they've never really thought of before. And that was something that I was really proud of in his interview, particularly. He's been interviewed for 65 years, almost 70 years. And there were multiple times in that interview where he said, "Oh, I've never really thought of things like that before," or "I've never been asked that before." That meant a lot to me. That was special to me to hear that from somebody who has spent his life public speaking and being interviewed. So to know that I was still able to find ways to get him to approach questions from a different perspective, that was pretty cool for me.
Yeah, it was. Perry, finding out how I was going to say you were one of his victims after that one. No, Perry, how did you feel being interviewed in such a long form? Because that's not normal.
You're right. Dan has this amazing gift for getting to the heart of the matter. And that takes time once you're there. So it wasn't any drag on me, or I was just as fascinated talking to him and answering his questions, which were all really good questions that delved into areas that, are not always asked on a podcast. And he gave me a great deal of latitude to just run on at the mouth and wax poetic, which I tend to do when I'm not stopped. So it was just marvelous. And I hadn't listened to any of the other podcasts before I met him and taped the podcast that I did with him. But once I started listening, I kind of felt a little, upset that, I wasn't somebody that he treated special. He does this for everybody, but that's great, because it really adds a kind of luster, I think, to his podcast that not very many others do, because he touches on such profound subjects that, delve into the heart and soul of something. Like he was saying, if you're talking to Henry Aaron, you want to ask him, like, what was it like growing up in the South facing the kind of racism that you did? Not, what did you have for lunch yesterday? Something like that. So yeah, he's an excellent interviewer. And listening to his interviews with Alex Cheremetoff and Bobby Richardson, and I'm definitely going to listen to Marjorie's podcast very soon. But I recommend every episode. And like I said, the liner notes that he creates for each episode are just works of art. And I really appreciate what you did for mine, Dan.
Thank you very much.
They're just wonderful. A lot of fun.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I doing this, I thought, let me see, I want to have all these superficial questions to the guy who delves in deep. So I felt a lot of pressure here. So when Dixie asked questions, I felt good. Dixie's asking some tougher questions.
Yeah.
I'm fine with superficial questions. I think that, that is interesting to hear about that kind of stuff with somebody, especially somebody who most people don't know. But, when I'm talking to, because the goal of the podcast has always been, I want to talk to major leaguers. I want to talk to Mike Trout. I want to talk to Rob Manfred. I want to talk to people who, I don't care what they had for lunch yesterday, like Perry said. Like, I want to know who you are as a person, and what made you who you are, and what are the things that you're proud of. So there is definitely a time and a place for the superficial questions and the fluff questions and get to know you and just have a light, fun conversation. That's just not what I'm trying to do with my podcast. That's all.
Well, you do a great job. Stu signed out. He said, good stuff. I got to go. Thanks, Dan, and everybody. So
thanks, Stu.
Yeah. So that was good. We're at the hour and a half mark. We're really taking a lot of Dan's time.
That's okay.
Dixie.
I have another question. This one I'll do verbally, hoping that I can get it out. Going back to the museum, having a year and a half of no visitors is an abomination. But on the other side, has that time that you didn't have to worry about visitors given you time to sit back and think about great things for the museum that you otherwise might not have had time to think about?
Absolutely. Great question. Thanks for sticking around tonight. We have been as incredibly active on social media as possible. I started, like I said, a Twitter account, a Facebook group, or a Facebook page, and an Instagram page for the museum. It's been hard to keep up with posting content for a museum that isn't open for a year and a half. I've tried to stay as active on Twitter as possible, and that's where I have cultivated our biggest following. Like I said, we're closing on 5,000 members. I think we'll probably get there by the end of next week. And it's really fun to interact with people on that platform. But for Instagram, it's really hard to post a picture every day for a museum that isn't open. And frankly, the building hasn't, I haven't even been allowed to get inside of it until this past couple of weeks. It's been in a construction site and we haven't legally had the keys to get inside. So it's really hard for me to be able to create and post content on those platforms. And Facebook, you try and make some posts and get discussions going to keep people's interest up, but we haven't even really had a timeline of when realistically we're going to reopen. Originally we were told we were going to open April 8th, 2020. And then we got pushed back to July, and then we got pushed back to November, and then we got pushed back to January of 2021. And then so it's just like, we don't want to keep saying a date and then miss it because there hasn't been any progress or clearly now there is. And we're a couple weeks away from opening. We're going to reopen June 15th. But for so many months, I just knew it was going to make us look bad if we kept saying, yeah, we're going to open in 6 weeks when we hadn't even laid a foundation yet for the new edition. Like, there's no way 6 weeks is a reasonable timeline. And so it's just going to, again, everything comes down to credibility. And so I knew that if we kind of mislead people or make things seem like they're going better than they are, it's just going to hurt us in the long run. So I've tried to kind of, couch expectations and hopefully exceed what people are thinking. But yeah, like you said, all this downtime has given us an incredible opportunity to rebuild our website from the ground up. That's something I did last April and May. We started a new membership program for the first time in our museum's history. We've done all sorts of research that we could, redesigning the layout of the museum. So, taking stock of every single piece that was in the museum, deciding what pictures we want to go back up. And one of the things that kind of bothered me, when I would go to the museum previously, just as a visitor, before I had any association with it, as the executive director, the famous image that is actually behind me right now, the Charles Conlon photo, we had that image in the museum 4 or 5 different times. And it was always different. Like one of them, it would be a painting, and one of them would be a charcoal drawing, and one of them would be the photograph. But it's the same image every time. Do we need that image more than once? Like that kind of stuff bothered me. So, you know, with all the hundreds of photos that have been taken of Joe over the years, we really wanted to be methodical about what image goes where, what ones get used. You know, obviously we're going to rotate things out over the course of time, but to get set up initially, you know, we want to do it in a chronological order. So we've got one room that is his White Sox career. One room is his professional baseball career before the White Sox. So we've got his time with the Philadelphia Athletics, his time with the Savannah Indians in 1909, his time with the New Orleans Pelicans in 1910, and then his time with Cleveland, both as a Cleveland Nap and Cleveland Indian. So that's all in one room too. And being able to do some research on the side that we would have never really had the time for before. There's a ballpark in Spartanburg, South Carolina, which is about a half hour, 45 minutes away from Greenville. And Spartanburg in the 1960s and 70s was the minor league affiliate of the Phillies. So in I believe 73, I'm drawing a blank on the date, but I think it's in the early 70s when Shibe Park, which then became known as Connie Mack Stadium, was torn down and demolished. The Phillies were tenants at that time. It was originally built for Connie Mack and the Philadelphia Athletics, and it was erected in 1909. And that happened to be one of the years that Joe played in Philadelphia. So Joe played his first 5 games as a member of the Athletics in 1908 when they played their home games at Columbia Park. And then his next 5 games as a major leaguer were in 1909 for the Athletics when they played their home games at Shibe Park. So when Shibe Park was demolished, the Phillies were the tenants, and they sent 582 seats to their minor league affiliate in Spartanburg, South Carolina, to refurnish their stadium. So we've got 582 of these seats from the original Shibe Park, which is where Joe played his games in 1909, 30 minutes away from me. And I would have never even known about this until I dug and was doing research because I had 18 months off. And so I got in touch with the person who was in charge of that renovation of Spartanburg. That's called Duncan Park in Spartanburg, South Carolina. It was built in 1924. They've had an incredible history in their own right. The Yankees came up and played spring training games there in the 30s and 40s. So Lou Gehrig and Joe DiMaggio played on that field. Negro Leaguers played on that field. That park has an incredible history in its own right. But I knew that they had these seats from Shibe Park, and we have an original seat from Comiskey Park in our museum where Joe played with the White Sox. And I figured, hey, why not try and get these seats from Shibe Park to put them in the Philadelphia room. So I got in touch with the guy who was in charge of that renovation, and he said, absolutely, come on by and I'll give you a seat. So, those types of things would have never happened without this downtime. And so, yeah, it's been awful not having a single person walk through our doors. And it's been a real financial burden to try and stay afloat these past 18 months. But it has given us the opportunity to do things like that we would have never otherwise had the chance to do or the time to do. Our staff is so small. We've got a couple of really great volunteers, but for the most part, it's a very small operation. So, we're stretched pretty thin in terms of being able to take time and do new research and hunt down new artifacts and things like that. So, forget the budget. The time is a real issue as well. So these 18 months that we've been closed have been a blessing and a curse. Let's put it that way.
Speaking of artifacts, Dan, did you ever find those matching dishes that you were looking for?
I did.
All right.
And I don't want to post it on social media yet because, we've got members of the Jackson family who I'm trying to keep it, in the dark right now because we're going to invite them for a special tour before we open. But we're doing something really special in the kitchen because, like I said, our museum is the house that Joe and Katie lived in. So 2 of the rooms we're trying to recreate. So the kitchen we're going to have as accurate as possible. and as period appropriate as possible. And that's going to be where we hang all of the photos of Katie that we have. So the kitchen, not to make it this way, but the kitchen is going to be Katie's room in the house. And then the living room, we have a photo of Joe in 1949 sitting in a chair in front of the fireplace. And that fireplace is still intact. Behind him in the photo are 2 radios. One is an R32 Victor radio console from 1929. And then the one sitting on top of that is General Electric L630 from 1941. I found both of those radios. One of them was in New York. One of them was in Georgia. I literally drove to New York to pick up a radio for our museum because we're going to recreate that photo that we have, and people will be able to walk in that room and see it exactly as Joe saw it in the photo that we'll have on display. So again, like I said, since we don't have game worn uniforms and game use this and game use that, we've got to be really creative with the displays that we do and the things that we put inside our museum and the artifacts that we can collect. So that's the type of stuff that we're trying to do to make it a really unique experience for our visitors, and one that they're going to want to take photos of and share those photos on social media as well.
Cool.
If I recall from the Mike Miller podcast, was Landis's picture in the bedroom in the museum before?
It was in one of the bedrooms, yeah.
Yeah. That, the idea of even having it in the museum almost sounds sacrilegious.
Yeah.
And I know the role he played, but yeah, when I heard that, I thought, no.
Well, yeah, again, that kind of goes back to credibility, where, if you tell a story, if you've got a museum about the 1990s Bulls and you don't have anywhere in that museum any mention of the Detroit Pistons, you lose credibility. That's part of the story. And as much as we all hate Isaiah Thomas, you got to talk about him. Michael Jordan wouldn't have been Michael Jordan without having to make it, climb over the mountaintop of the Pistons. So, that's the same kind of thing with Kennesaw Mountain Landis, where do we like him? No, not really. But he sure as hell is part of the story of Joe Jackson and the Black Sox. So, to have a museum dedicated to Joe and not have his picture and not be able to tell his story, or at least parts of it, that would just, again, call our credibility into question and make people think that.
But in the bedroom.
Yeah, that's what I was saying. Not, yeah.
Well, when you say it that way, I definitely understand the connotation. But when you think the fact that our museum is the house, there are only 3 rooms to put things in, and 2 of them are bedrooms. The other one is the living room. So it's got to go somewhere.
You should be one of the skeletons in the closet.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah. Any other questions for Dan, or Dan, any last words of wisdom you would like to send our way?
Just if you're a social media person, follow us on social media. The museum, all of the accounts are at Shoeless Museum. So we've got Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. If you want to follow the podcast, it's at Shoeless Podcast for everything. So Facebook, Twitter, Instagram for that as well. The website for the podcast, if you want to check out the liner notes or just learn a little bit more about me or the podcast itself, is www.shoelesspodcast.com. And for the museum, it's shoelessjoejackson.org. And like we mentioned earlier, please, if you want to become a member, that would be great, a huge help for us, and get us started off on the right foot when we reopen on June 15th. If you are in the area or want to come make a visit to the museum, I'd be happy to show you around and give you a little behind the scenes tour and show you all the things that we've been working on. But if you are living in Wisconsin or Minnesota or wherever you are, just follow us on social media, and I'll do the best I can to post pictures and videos to at least show you what the experience would be like if you can't physically make it out to us.
Are there any ceremonies planned for the opening of the museum on the 15th?
Unfortunately, not this year. We didn't have a concrete date until literally this afternoon.
Okay.
Last week we thought we were going to be open by June 1st, but we just found out this afternoon that we got pushed back again. And with all the COVID stuff going on, we didn't feel right trying to congregate a couple hundred people in a small location. So we're gonna do something next year, and I'm thinking probably around Joe's birthday. His birthday is July 16th, so we're gonna try and start making July 16th every year a big celebration in Greenville. So maybe, depending on what day of the week that falls next summer, maybe do some sort of like grand reopening on that day. But no, unfortunately, this year we could not plan something.
Okay, no, that makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah.
I will have these hashtags and the websites in the article in the newsletter going out in next week
Great.
with the video for this as well. And so we'll spread the word. I'll try and follow once the museum's open, get something in the newsletter for that as well, just so that people know. I'm looking forward to getting down there again to see everything that you've changed. I have to go visit my brother in Jacksonville, Florida. It must be you guys must be close enough to that somehow.
Yeah, I think Jacksonville is like 6 hours away, something like that.
Oh, I didn't think it was that close. I just figured I'd make it an excuse, the detour. But yeah, so it sounds good.
Cool.
Anything else for Dan? If not, thank you. This was it met every hope I had and definitely exceeded. This was a very, very good meeting. So thank you, sir. I'm looking forward to your next podcast as well.
Thank you so much. I appreciate your time and for wanting to have me on in the first place. Couldn't be happier to be here.
You're welcome. We'll stay in touch.
All right.
Okay.